Los Angeles. The city of stars, where countless dreams are made and broken. Among those drawn to the lights was Yana, a young woman from Ukraine. With big aspirations and a heart full of hope. She arrived in this vibrant city with a single goal: to build a future for herself as a model. Yana quickly found her footing, becoming a rising star in the modeling world. With her looks and determination, she seemed to have it all: fame, fortune, and a boyfriend who seemed to adore her. Black, a man of wealth and charm, appeared to be her perfect match. Together, they created the perfect picture of happiness. The red carpets, the flash of cameras, the admiration of fans. Yana had everything she had ever dreamed of. Her rise to prominence seemed inevitable, and Los Angeles embraced her with open arms. But little did she know, the path to success would come with hidden dangers, disguised as love and security. To the outside world, Yana and Black's relationship was the perfect partnership. They were the ideal couple, inseparable and full of joy. Black, with his wealth and power, seemed to be everything Yana needed: supportive, protective, and always there for her. It was a love story that many would envy. Her life, broadcasted to thousands of followers, was a constant stream of beauty and happiness. But behind the picture-perfect images, there were cracks that no one could see. Small, subtle signs that Yana's life was far from the dream she portrayed to the world. Behind the glamour, Yana worked tirelessly, attending casting calls, photo shoots, and interviews, hoping to land the next big opportunity. Every day was a challenge. Every day a chance to prove her worth in an industry that was both demanding and competitive. As time passed, however, the pressures of success began to weigh heavily on Yana. Black, once her greatest supporter, began to show a different side of himself. A side that was possessive, controlling, and increasingly suspicious. He would question her every move, grow jealous of the people around her, and demand more and more of her attention. Yana's once carefree life began to shift. What had been a dream come true started to feel like a heavy burden. The stress of her career, combined with the strain in her relationship, left her feeling isolated and unsure. She had built everything she ever wanted. But now, she was unsure whether it was all worth the price. Even though Yana had everything anyone could wish for: a successful career, a loving boyfriend, and a life that seemed to be straight out of a fairy tale, something inside her was unsettled. She felt a growing tension, an invisible weight that was pushing her further into uncertainty. Despite the growing tension in their relationship, Yana did her best to keep the peace. She wanted to believe that Black's concerns were just a sign of his love for her, that his jealousy was proof of how deeply he cared. But slowly, she began to realize that what she had once seen as love might have been something more dangerous: a need to control, to dominate, and to isolate. Her life was full of contradictions. She was living the dream: fame, beauty, and luxury. But at what cost? Her relationship with Black, once full of affection and adoration, had turned into something that was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Yet, Yana couldn't bring herself to break free. She still believed in the love she had with him, convinced that the good times would return. Yana's story, like the city she lived in, was a beautiful contradiction. A dream full of light, but with shadows lurking just out of sight. And on the 25th of May, 2016, those shadows would become impossible to ignore. Yana's journey, filled with ambition, love, and success, was about to take a dark turn. One that would change her life, and the lives of those who loved her forever. Yana's life, once full of promise and success, seemed to be going perfectly. She had found love, a partner in black who showered her with affection and gifts. Together, they built a life in Los Angeles that many would envy, comfortable, beautiful, and seemingly unshakable. Their days were filled with laughter, travel, and quiet moments of intimacy. It was the life Yana had always dreamed of. But despite the outward appearance of a perfect life, something had begun to shift. It was subtle at first: longer silences between messages, missed phone calls, and fewer updates from Yana. Her mother, living in Ukraine, grew anxious as the days passed without hearing from her daughter. The love they shared was strong, and Yana always made it a point to stay in touch. But now, there was a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. Yana's mother, with trembling hands, dialed the number of the local authorities. Her voice quivered as she explained her growing concern. The police, recognizing the urgency of the situation, assured her they would investigate. Still, the hours dragged on with no news, and every passing moment felt heavier. The distance between Ukraine and Los Angeles only made the situation feel more helpless. Meanwhile, the authorities arrived at Yana's apartment building, responding to the concerned call. They had no idea what they would find behind the closed doors of the seemingly perfect life Yana had built. As they approached her apartment, a sense of dread began to settle over the officers. The door to Yana's home was locked, and there was no response when they knocked. Their instincts told them something was wrong. They forced the door open, not knowing what they would encounter. Inside, the scene was chilling. The apartment, once filled with warmth and joy, was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, and every step taken by the officers seemed to echo in the stillness. As they searched the rooms, they began to notice signs that something was terribly amiss. The apartment was impeccably clean, but there were subtle clues that told them a violent event had occurred. A struggle, perhaps, or something far worse. As they moved further into the apartment, the officers noticed signs of struggle: an overturned chair, a broken vase, and a scattering of personal items. But the most unsettling detail was the lack of any sound, no cries for help, no sign of Yana. As they continued their search, they reached the bedroom and discovered the heart-wrenching truth. In the bedroom, the officers made a grim discovery. There, they found evidence of violence, a scene far removed from the peaceful life Yana had appeared to live. The details were not immediately clear, but one thing was certain: something had gone horribly wrong. Yana's mother, still waiting for news, had no idea that the nightmare had already begun. The carefully crafted image of Yana's perfect life was crumbling, revealing dark truths that no one could have imagined. What appeared to be a loving relationship was slowly being exposed for what it truly was: a toxic and dangerous situation. In the days leading up to that fateful moment, the tension in Yana's life had been building. Black, once her loving and supportive partner, had begun to show signs of possessiveness, jealousy, and control. It was in the small, seemingly insignificant moments: the way he looked at her when she spoke to other people, the way he demanded more of her time, the way he made her feel guilty for things she hadn't done. Yana, caught in the whirlwind of her career and relationship, had started to feel trapped. She was no longer the carefree woman who arrived in Los Angeles with big dreams. Now, she was under constant scrutiny, her every move monitored, her independence slowly slipping away. The dark undercurrents in her relationship with Black had been there all along, but Yana, in her quest for success and love, had failed to see the warning signs. As the investigation continued, the police uncovered more disturbing clues. Yana's phone records showed multiple missed calls from her mother in the days leading up to her disappearance. But it wasn't just the calls that caught the officers' attention. The messages sent from Yana's phone to Black painted a picture of a woman who was not only worried about her safety but also trying to reach out for help, even when she felt isolated. The evidence gathered in Yana's apartment suggested that a violent altercation had taken place. Signs of physical struggle, bloodstains, and unsettling injuries were found, confirming the worst fears of those investigating. Yana had not simply disappeared, she had been attacked. The peaceful life she once knew had been shattered in an instant. The investigation was now in full swing. The police, piecing together the clues, turned their focus on Black. They discovered that he had been the last person to see Yana. But there was more. The traces of violence, the bloodstains, and even the signs of a violent struggle pointed directly to him. Yet, despite the growing evidence, Black's behavior remained calm and unruffled. Black, when questioned, remained composed. His words were calculated, his demeanor cold and controlled. The police couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, and as they dug deeper into his background, they began to uncover more unsettling details. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Yana's perfect life had been a facade. What seemed like a loving relationship had, in reality, been a carefully constructed trap. Black had, over time, manipulated and controlled Yana, isolating her from the people who cared about her, all while maintaining an image of the perfect partner. Yana's mother, who had flown to Los Angeles as soon as she heard the news, could hardly recognize the world her daughter had been living in. The woman she had known full of life, joy, and promise was now the subject of a police investigation. She could only wonder what had gone so terribly wrong and how she had missed the signs. The evidence was mounting, and the case was taking a dark turn. The perfect life Yana had once known was unraveling, and the truth was slowly coming to light. But would the authorities be able to uncover the full extent of what had happened? And would Yana's tragic fate ever truly be understood? When the authorities arrived at Yana's apartment, they were met with an unsettling sight. The door was locked, and there was no response from inside. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, a sense of dread creeping into the air. Yana's mother had expressed her concerns, and now, the police feared the worst. The once vibrant apartment building, home to Yana's dreams, now felt cold and foreboding. With no way of knowing what awaited them inside, the officers made the difficult decision to force entry. As the door swung open, the officers were greeted by silence. The apartment, though undisturbed in some areas, held an atmosphere of tension. Each step they took seemed to amplify the eerie quiet. The once warm and inviting space now felt foreign, as though something crucial had been removed. The officers were trained to handle situations like this, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to encounter. As they moved further into the apartment, it became clear that something violent had taken place. The normally pristine space now showed signs of a struggle, objects displaced, furniture knocked over, and faint traces of blood. A sense of disorder pervaded the apartment, as though everything that had once been in its place had been violently rearranged. The room seemed to tell a story of something much darker than a mere break-in. Then, in the corner of the room, they found a disturbing sight. A blood-stained rug lay in the center of the floor, its fibers matted and damp. Shards of broken glass from a photo frame were scattered around, evidence of the violence that had transpired. But it was the kitchen that offered a chilling discovery. A knife, its blade still glistening with fresh blood, sat ominously on the counter. The officers knew then that they were dealing with something far more sinister than a simple disappearance. In the bedroom, the officers found the body of Yana. She lay motionless on the bed, her once beautiful face now pale and still. The signs of violence were unmistakable. Bruises, cuts, and marks on her body suggested she had endured a great deal of pain before passing. Her clothes were disheveled, and her hands were clenched tightly, as though she had been trying to hold on to something, someone before the end. Her body showed signs of a violent struggle. The bloodstains on her hands suggested that she had fought to defend herself. Under her fingernails, the officers found traces of DNA, evidence that she had clawed at her attacker in a final, desperate attempt to survive. The sheer brutality of the scene was difficult to comprehend. This wasn't just a crime, it was a tragic act of violence, one that had stolen away the life of a young woman full of potential and dreams. Among the scattered items on the nightstand, One picture stood out: Yana and Black, both smiling, their love apparent in their eyes. It was a picture of happiness, taken before everything changed. It was a reminder of what Yana had once had, a life full of promise, but now that promise was shattered. The contrast between the happy memory and the gruesome scene before the officers was jarring. How had things gone so terribly wrong? The officers carefully examined every inch of the apartment, looking for any clues that might explain what had happened. They followed a trail of blood that led them toward the bathroom, but there were no immediate answers. Instead, the bathroom, though mostly untouched, seemed to hold its own set of mysteries. It was almost as if Yana had tried to escape into that space, but had been stopped short. On the bathroom door, the officers found a faint but chilling clue: a bloody handprint, barely visible but unmistakable. It suggested that Yana had tried to escape, reaching for the door in a desperate attempt to flee from whatever horror was unfolding in her apartment. But she hadn't made it. Whatever happened next, the evidence pointed to something far worse than a simple accident. The officers stood silently for a moment, taking in the scene. The apartment had once been a place of comfort, a home where Yana had hoped to build her future. Now, it was a crime scene, a place of grief and loss, filled with the echoes of what had transpired. It was clear that Yana had not gone willingly, and that whatever had happened here had left her with little chance for survival. With each new discovery, the officers began to piece together a horrifying picture of what had transpired in Yana's final moments. But even with the mounting evidence, there were still questions. What had caused this? Who was responsible? And why did someone who had seemed to have it all end up here, in a pool of blood, her life so tragically cut short? As the investigation continued, the officers found other small but significant pieces of evidence. A piece of jewelry, a necklace Yana had worn often, lay discarded on the floor. It wasn't just a random item, it was a personal piece, something that meant something to her. Why was it left behind? Was it a sign of struggle, or had it been discarded on purpose? With each passing hour, the police's focus turned more and more toward Black, Yana's boyfriend. He was the last person to see her alive, and the mounting evidence suggested his involvement in the crime. Yet, despite the weight of the evidence, his reactions remained oddly composed, his demeanor too controlled. Was this the face of a grieving boyfriend or something far more sinister? The discovery of Yana's body was only the beginning. The investigation had only just begun, and there were still many unanswered questions. The apartment was filled with clues, but the puzzle pieces were not yet complete. As the officers continued their search, they knew they were inching closer to a truth that would shock the world. What had led to this tragedy, and who was ultimately responsible for taking Yana's life? With no clear suspect in the beginning, the police began meticulously collecting every piece of evidence that could shed light on what had happened. Each detail, no matter how small, was crucial in unraveling the mystery. The crime scene was thoroughly examined, with investigators focusing on seemingly insignificant clues, fingerprints, bloodstains, fibers, and anything that could tell the story of that fateful night. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the evidence would not speak for itself. It would need to be interpreted carefully, and sometimes, the smallest of details could make the biggest difference. At first glance, the apartment seemed to hold no immediate answers, but as the investigators combed through the scene with expert precision, they started to piece together the disturbing reality. The crime scene was far from being random, it seemed carefully orchestrated, with every item and piece of evidence contributing to the dark puzzle. The bloodstains on the carpet, the broken glass, the damaged furniture each told a story of violence, of a struggle that had taken place not just in one moment but over time, with deep emotional and physical consequences. As the investigation continued, the police expanded their search for clues beyond Yana's apartment. They turned to security cameras from nearby buildings, hoping to capture any footage that could provide insight into what had happened. The footage showed people walking, cars driving by, and city life continuing as usual, but something caught the investigators' attention. A figure, a man, moving quickly near Yana's building on the night of the murder. His movements were suspicious, and when the officers enhanced the footage, they realized that the person in question was none other than Black, Yana's boyfriend. Seeing Black in the footage raised more questions than it answered. What was he doing there? Was it just a coincidence? The footage showed Black near the building in the hours leading up to Yana's death, and it seemed to suggest that he had been near the scene long before the police had arrived. The investigators knew that they had to dig deeper. No longer could they dismiss his presence as mere happenstance. Meanwhile, police officers reached out to neighbors and friends, hoping to uncover any additional information that might help them piece together the timeline of events. Many of Yana's neighbors described hearing strange noises coming from her apartment that night, loud voices, the sound of something being thrown. Some even reported seeing a man leaving the building in the early hours of the morning, but none could confirm who it was. The only thing that became increasingly clear was that someone close to Yana, someone she trusted, was involved in the tragedy. As more time passed, the investigation started to take shape. A timeline of events was pieced together, and the evidence began to speak louder. Forensic experts found traces of Yana's DNA under Black's fingernails. The blood found on his clothing matched Yana's, and his presence in the building at the time of her death was undeniable. It wasn't just circumstantial anymore, the physical evidence was building a case against him. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was found on Black's clothing. Bloodstains, unmistakably Yana's, were discovered on a jacket he had worn that evening. The forensic analysis confirmed that the blood was fresh and had come from Yana. The question now was, how did Black become covered in her blood? Was he a victim in all of this, or had he played a far darker role in her death? The search of Black's home yielded more unsettling clues. Hidden in his personal belongings, investigators found items that suggested he had been preparing for something sinister. Though there were no clear answers yet, the pieces were starting to come together, and the pattern was undeniable. Every step of the investigation was leading toward one conclusion: Black was no innocent bystander in this tragedy. As the investigation deepened, the police found more connections between Black and the crime scene. There were subtle signs of a planned attack, a deliberate attempt to stage the scene, to cover his tracks. The broken glass, the displaced furniture, the careful way in which the apartment had been turned into a chaotic mess, it all pointed to someone trying to cover up their involvement. But what was his motive? Why would Black, someone who appeared to care for Yana, turn against her so violently? Yana and Black had shared what seemed like a perfect relationship. He had been supportive of her dreams, helping her climb the ladder of success in the modeling world. Together, they seemed unstoppable. But as the investigation uncovered more about their relationship, a different story began to emerge. Was Black truly the loving boyfriend he appeared to be, or had there been signs of jealousy, manipulation, and control all along? The police were beginning to question everything about their relationship, and the answers were not as pretty as they had once seemed. One of the most telling pieces of evidence came from Yana's personal messages. As investigators dug deeper into her phone records and emails, they discovered a pattern of increasingly controlling behavior from Black. His messages, though not overtly violent, revealed a growing sense of possessiveness and jealousy. Yana had often talked about her desire for independence, her dreams of a career in modeling, and her desire to carve out a life for herself, something Black had tried to control. She had begun to pull away from him, something that Black couldn't tolerate. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the investigation was far from over. The more the detectives uncovered, the more complicated the case became. With each new piece of evidence, the picture of what had happened to Yana became clearer, but there was still so much left unanswered. The motive behind the murder, Black's involvement, and his true intentions were still shrouded in mystery. What had driven him to commit such a terrible act? Was it a crime of passion, or was there a darker side to their relationship that no one had seen before? The investigation was at a crossroads. With the evidence pointing firmly in Black's direction, the police were ready to make their move. But they knew they had to be careful. The next steps were crucial. They needed to build a strong case that would stand up in court, one that would finally give Yana's family the justice they had been desperately seeking. As the investigation reached a critical juncture, all eyes were on Black. The man who had once been seen as the doting boyfriend, the one who showered Yana with love and affection, was now under suspicion. The authorities needed answers that could explain how someone so close to Yana could be capable of such violence. They needed to understand the unthinkable. Why had Yana, a young woman with so much potential and a bright future, met her tragic end at the hands of someone who claimed to love her? Days of questioning, of unrelenting pressure, finally brought Black to a breaking point. He had been calm, composed, even evasive at times, but something in his demeanor began to change as the weight of the evidence grew. As the detectives pressed him, searching for the truth, a shift occurred. The man who had once acted as though nothing was wrong began to crack under the pressure. In an unexpected turn of events, Black finally spoke. The words, slow and trembling, left his lips one after another. It was as if the weight of his own actions had caught up to him, and now, there was no turning back. He confessed to what had transpired between them. How, over time, his love for Yana had evolved into something darker, something unhealthy. What had started as admiration for her beauty and independence had slowly twisted into jealousy and possessiveness. As Yana's career blossomed and her independence grew, Black's insecurities festered beneath the surface. What had once been admiration had become a suffocating need to control her every move. Black described how he had become consumed by a feeling of losing control, of feeling inferior to the world Yana was building for herself. He confessed that, in his mind, he had to be the one who controlled everything: their relationship, her career, even her emotions. It wasn't just about love anymore. It had become about domination, and the thought of her slipping away, of her breaking free from his grasp, was more than he could bear. Over time, Black's jealousy grew stronger. He couldn't bear the attention Yana was receiving from others, the praise she was getting for her beauty and talent. The once supportive boyfriend began to resent her success. The love he had for her had slowly morphed into a toxic obsession, and the more he tried to control her, the more distant she became. Yana had begun to seek out her independence, and Black couldn't accept it. He wanted her to stay with him, under his control, in his world. On the night of May 25, 2016, something in Black snapped. He had tried to talk to Yana, to make her see things his way, but she was resolute. She was done with the manipulation, done with the control. Her dreams, her future, she could see it all clearly now, and she was ready to live her life on her own terms. And that, to Black, was the breaking point. He admitted that the argument escalated quickly. What started as a simple disagreement over their future together turned into something far more violent. He became angry, furious, even at the thought of losing her. Words were exchanged, accusations were made, and in that moment, Black lost all control. In a fit of rage, he acted out in a way that would haunt him forever. Black confessed to pushing Yana during the argument, and the violence escalated quickly. In his anger, he lashed out, causing Yana to fall and strike her head. As she lay there, dazed and disoriented, Black realized what he had done. But instead of seeking help, he panicked. His mind, clouded by fear and rage, drove him to take further actions to cover up what he had done. Black's confession was chilling. He explained how, in his panic, he had tried to hide the evidence of his actions. He moved her body, staged the scene to make it appear as if something else had happened, and attempted to clean up the bloodstains. But nothing could erase the truth that lay beneath the surface: the truth of his violent jealousy, his controlling nature, and his inability to let go of a relationship that had already begun to unravel. As Black spoke, his voice trembled with guilt, but it was clear that he wasn't truly remorseful for what he had done to Yana, only for the consequences of his actions. His confession, though a breakthrough in the case, raised more questions. Was this truly a moment of uncontrollable rage, or was it the culmination of months, perhaps years, of manipulation, control, and emotional abuse? Black's story seemed to paint him as a man driven to extremes, but it also painted a portrait of a man who, deep down, knew he was losing control over his own emotions. Ultimately, the chilling truth was revealed: Black had killed Yana not in a moment of self-defense, but out of his own emotional turmoil, jealousy, possessiveness, and an overwhelming need to maintain control over a relationship that had already begun to slip away. It was a devastating betrayal of the love he had once claimed to feel for her. The man who had once promised her a bright future had instead stolen it from her in the most tragic of ways. The confession brought an end to the mystery that had haunted the investigation, but it left a deep wound in the community. The tragic case of Yana was far from over. It was only just beginning to reveal the true horror of what had transpired in the confines of a relationship that had appeared perfect from the outside. The loss of Yana left a deep, irreparable void in the hearts of those who loved her. Her family, who had supported her dreams from the very beginning, were left grappling with an emptiness they could not comprehend. Friends who had known her as a bright, lively soul, full of promise, now found themselves lost in grief, unable to understand how someone so full of life had been taken so violently, so tragically. Her fans, who had admired her from afar, were shaken to their core by the senselessness of it all. For Yana's mother, the pain was unbearable. Having raised her daughter with dreams of a better life in America, she had hoped for a future where Yana would achieve everything she had worked so hard for. But now, that future was nothing but an unfulfilled promise. The phone calls, the smiles, the dreams of seeing her daughter succeed, everything was lost in a single, tragic moment. Yana's friends, who had celebrated with her during her successes, now found themselves mourning a life taken too soon. They could not understand why someone who had so much to offer the world, someone who radiated joy and light, had been brought to such a tragic end. They spoke of the moments they shared with her, laughing, dreaming, planning for the future. And yet, in a flash, all of those moments were gone. The memories, now tainted with loss, were all they had left. In the wake of this tragedy, the justice system took its course. Black, who had once been the man Yana trusted most, now stood at the center of it all, held accountable for his actions. His confession had already shattered the illusion of a perfect relationship, and now, the consequences of his choices were coming to light. No amount of legal proceedings could undo the damage that had been done, but the law would still take its course. Despite Black's confession, despite the evidence, there was no way to undo the destruction he had caused. He was sentenced to life in prison, an outcome that seemed cold and distant compared to the warmth of Yana's life, which had been stolen. But no punishment could bring her back. No amount of time served behind bars could heal the wounds that had been inflicted on those who loved her. For Yana's family, justice could never fully ease their pain. The loss was something that would stay with them forever, an unhealable scar that no amount of time or legal retribution could fix. Yana was gone, and they were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered future. The dreams they had shared with her, the hopes for her future, her career, and the life she had been building were now just memories, painful reminders of what had been lost. Her personal belongings, now scattered in the apartment she once called home, remained as a silent testament to what had been. A notebook with scribbled notes about upcoming photo shoots. A suitcase half packed with clothes for a trip she would never take. These small, seemingly insignificant items were all that remained of the life she had been building. But they spoke volumes about the dreams that had been extinguished far too soon. Her friends, who had shared in her joys, her laughter, and her triumphs, now struggled to come to terms with her absence. They could not understand how something so senseless, so cruel, could happen to someone as vibrant and full of promise as Yana. Each candle lit in her memory was a symbol of love, of remembrance, and of the light she had brought into their lives. But the silence that followed each flicker was deafening, because no matter how many candles they lit, no matter how many tears they shed, Yana would never walk through the door again. The tragedy of Yana's life and death left a deep, lasting impact on all who knew her. It was a stark reminder of how fragile life can be, how easily the darkness can creep into the light. It was also a painful reflection of how the illusions we create about love and trust can sometimes mask a far more dangerous reality. For those who loved Yana, the pain of her loss would never truly fade. But they would carry her memory with them, honoring her life and the dreams she had to leave behind. Yana may have been taken from this world far too soon, but her legacy, her beauty, her spirit, and her dreams would continue to live on. And for those who knew her, that was the only comfort they could hold onto in the wake of her untimely death. The story of Yana is a tragic reminder of how things may not always be as they seem. Beneath the glittering surface of success and glamour, there are often hidden struggles, unseen pain, and dark truths that can remain out of sight until it's too late. Yana's life, filled with so much potential and promise, became a cautionary tale of misplaced trust and betrayal. She was a young woman with dreams, with love, and with hope, yet her life was tragically cut short by someone she thought she could trust the most. Yana's story is not just the story of a tragic ending, it is a reflection of the fragile nature of trust, love, and human relationships. It urges us to take a step back and truly examine the dynamics of our own connections with others. Are we aware of the signs that may point to unhealthy patterns? Do we recognize the subtle ways in which manipulation or control can creep into our lives? Yana's life and death remind us that we must always remain vigilant in safeguarding our emotional well-being, and that love should never be a weapon. This tragedy serves as a powerful lesson to all of us. It is easy to be swept away by the illusions of perfect relationships, especially when they are built on trust and affection. But sometimes, that trust can be twisted, and love can turn into something darker, something that threatens to erode the very essence of who we are. We must never allow ourselves to be blinded by false appearances or the charm of someone who may not have our best interests at heart. As we reflect on Yana's story, let us take the time to evaluate our own relationships. Let us be more mindful of the signs of emotional harm, manipulation, and control. And let us never forget that true love is built on mutual respect, trust, and safety. Our well-being must always be the priority, and we must not be afraid to walk away from situations that compromise our happiness or safety. Thank you for watching. Remember to be cautious, be kind, and always prioritize your well-being in every relationship.